Hello, everybody. My name is Zach Parrish. I'm the programming librarian here at the Bexley Public Library. So we're on a tight reading schedule, so we're going to get started. But if you want to grab any snacks or refreshments in the back, please help yourself. I just wanted to say really quick before we get started, 2024 is the Bexley Public Library centennial, so we are celebrating our 100th birthday. Yes. It's not going back. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Again, if you want to help yourself to the tea, lemonade, water, or some snacks, that's fine. I just wanted to kick us off with a few words of why we're here. Again, briefly before we get started, 2024 is the library's 100th birthday, so we are doing lots of fun activities and events here at the library. We have an awesome author series lined up, so if you haven't seen the Centennial Guide, please grab one there in the back and check out all the cool events that we have coming up throughout the year. And I just want to say a few words of why we're here today. On this day, February 18th, Toni Morrison was born in 1931 in Lorain, Ohio. She was a generationally talented author, writer, mind. She wrote the 11 novels, including The Bluest Eye, Tar Baby, Sula, Beloved, Jazz. So some just all-time classics that will be read long before we're all gone. So she also published many nonfiction books, including The Origins of Others, The Source of Self-Regard, 3 plays, and many books for children written with her son Slade Morrison. In 2020, a resolution was passed by the Ohio House of Representatives, making February 18th officially Toni Morrison Day in Ohio, although every day is Toni Morrison Day. Today we're lucky to be joined by some local authors and poets. We have Vernell Bristow, Stevi Knighton, who performs under DearMsStevi, Donna Marbury, and Scott Woods with us, who will be sharing some of their favorite Toni Morrison passages and talking a little bit about her legacy and her influence on their work. And I'm going to just share something really quickly that Toni Morrison wrote. It's not from any of her books, but kind of pat ourselves on the back here at the library. This was a letter that Toni Morrison wrote to the Queens Public Library. She writes, "My second job as a teenager was shelving books at the only library in Lorain, Ohio. Every shift started with a tall stack of returned books, fiction, history, drama, poetry, everything. It didn't pay much, but it was magical. Then I got fired." The trouble was that instead of replacing the books on the shelves, I kept reading them. A title would catch my eye, I'd crack open the book just for a quick look, and pretty soon I'd forget the stack of returns. I didn't get far in my career as a librarian, but that experience opened my eyes and shaped my future. That's what libraries do. Just again, patting ourselves on the back at the library. And now I'm going to bring up our first reader today. Vernell Bristow is a poet and the co-founder of the popular open mic Writer's Block Poetry Night, which ran for 24 years before sunsetting in 2022. She is a revered performance poet who participated in regional, national, and international slam poetry competitions for several years, as well as the annual Columbus Arts Festival poetry competition. Please join me in welcoming Vernell Bristow.
Zach needs to get out of my presentation. He was all in my presentation, y'all. I'll explain when we get to that point. Oh, I am so excited to be here. Shout out to the Queen Toni Morrison on her birthday. I want to thank the Bexley Library for having this event. I want to thank Scott Woods for inviting me to be a part of it. I don't know, I've known Scott for many years, but I don't know if he knew that I was such a fan of Toni Morrison when he asked me. Yeah, I love her so much. And so when I was deciding what books of hers I wanted to read from, I kept going back and forth between The Bluest Eye and Beloved because I feel such personal connection to both of them. And then I was like, why do I have to choose? I'm doing both. So that's what you're getting. You're getting both. So I first, before I started, there are many reasons why I love Toni Morrison. But I'm gonna share 3 with you right up front, and you'll be able to see them, I think, manifest in what I share with you from her works. The first one is that let me pause. I find it very difficult to speak about Toni Morrison in the past tense because her legacy is ever present in my life right now, so you will hear me speak about her in the present tense. So Toni Morrison is unapologetically Black. I love her for it. Her writing, unapologetically Black. And that is, she was unafraid to write about things that America does not want to talk about. Systemic oppression, white supremacy, and the overbearing weight that is on people in America. The second reason, well, that was the second reason. The third reason why I like her is because she wrote about the power of community and the necessity of community. And in many books, that community also manifests in the necessity of sisterhood among Black women. And I hope you will see that resonate in the works that I share with you today. I'm going to go to Bluest Eye first, because in the chronology of my life, that's the book that I encountered first. It's also her first published book. I first encountered that book when I was in high school, somewhere around my junior and senior year. And that book put into amazing words some of the things that I was starting to witness in my own community. This Bluest Eye is set in Lorain, Ohio. I, at the time, was living in Covington, Kentucky, and some of the separation and segregation that she so skillfully displayed in The Bluest Eye, I saw in my own town, and it helped put some words to that. And then that whole concept, the bluest eye, the blue eyes, you know, at a time when I was like, since middle school, I was like, where do I fit in this standard of beauty that is happening in this country that does not make room for Black girls? It didn't then. And you know, and it's in some pockets it does now, but it's still a struggle. And I was also finding difficulty with that with my own brother and his dating choices and the dating choices of his friends, and overhearing him when I was 12 and they're like 16, 17 about why Black women are so ugly. Come on. So by the time that I encountered this book, you know, this book, along with 2 other books, Cotton Candy on a Rainy Day by Nikki Giovanni and the autobiography of Malcolm X, was like a trifecta of literary empowerment that was making sense of the world around me as I'm coming of age, trying to figure out why nobody in my community has enough, but everybody in these other communities have everything that they need. And that's just one of the reasons why I love her so much. In The Bluest Eye, which was published in 1970, I think it was around 1993, she published a foreword to a reprinting of the book where she is talking about her intentions for The Bluest Eye. And she's talking about this weight of racial oppression, systemic racial oppression, the machine, the fine-tuned machine of racial oppression in this country. And she mentions 2 groups of folks and how they respond, but then she says, but there are some who collapse silently, anonymously, with no voice to express or acknowledge it. They are invisible. The death of self-esteem can occur quickly, easily in children before their ego has legs, so to speak. Couple the vulnerability of youth with indifferent parents, dismissive adults, and a world which, in its language, laws, and images, reinforces despair, and the journey to destruction is sealed. The project, then, for this, my first book, was to enter the life of the one least likely to withstand such damaging forces because of youth, gender, and race. Begun as a Black narrative of psychological murder, the main character could not stand alone since her passivity made her a narrative void. So I invented friends, classmates who understood, even sympathized with her plight, but had the benefit of supportive parents and a feistiness all their own. Yet they were helpless as well. They could not save their friend from the world. She broke. And so that she is, in the bluest eye, is Pecola. Her feisty friends are Frida and Claudia. And so that's what that novel meant to me as a kid. But then, as I grew up, let's fast forward about 35 years, it meant something different, like it resonated with me differently. A couple of years ago, when I turned 50, my sister asked me, what did I want to do for my 50th birthday? Actually, her question was, where do you want to turn up for your 50th birthday? And I said, oh, child, no. I'm tired. I'm trying to turn down, like all the way down. I said, I really want to be sitting in a chair by a lake, like so relaxed that I'm barely conscious. Like that's what I want to be doing. And so she rented a lake house, on the shore of Lake Erie that happened to be in Lorraine. Beautiful house. And she knew that Toni Morrison was one of my favorite authors. And so she decided to give me a surprise on my birthday that unrivaled any present I've ever gotten. And she invited my good friend Tyrone to come up for the day. Hey, Tyrone. And she she curated a tour of 5 spots in Lorraine related to Toni Morrison. Such a tour does not exist, and so my corporate America sister, non-artistic sister, had to dive deep. She's reading old newspaper articles and everything to find these locations. And so the first location that she takes me to, she just forces me to get in the car. I don't know where we're going. To this day, I don't know if Tyrone knew what her plans were. I don't know. You didn't know? Okay, yeah. So she forces us into the car, and then she stops the car, and she's just like, get out. She's really bossy. And I'm standing next to a trash-filled empty lot. And I'm like, this is my 50th birthday. Why she got me standing next to this trash-filled empty lot? I said, girl, what's going on? She goes, it's not the lot. It's that house across the street. And it was an old house. There was not any houses on either side of it. Those lots were empty. And I'm looking at this old house like, what of it? And then she just produces note cards and begins reading the significance of this house, which was the home that Toni Morrison's family lived in when she was born. That's the home she came to after her mother gave birth to her. And she's reading all about her family and all of that, and I just start crying. I'm just reduced to tears. And I'm like, oh, that is so special. And I thought that was it. And she was like, get back in the car. There's more to see. And so we went by Toni Morrison Elementary, named after her. We went to the historical marker, the place where the historical marker is in Lorraine. This is where Zach stole the thunder, because it is outside of the Historical Society there, which was the place of the original library in Lorraine, and my sister read that exact quote that he read, and then we went to the current library, to the Toni Morrison reading room that she, when they wanted to honor her after the Nobel Prize, I don't want a street named after me, make this room with comfortable chairs for people to read books and stuff. And then she took me to the park. It is the only park in Lorraine that has beachfront access to Lake Erie. And her and I were there a few days prior, and we were just there talking about how beautiful it is. And then my sister read this excerpt from The Bluest Eye. The lakefront houses were the loveliest. Garden furniture, ornaments, windows like shiny eyeglasses, and no sign of life. The backyards of these houses fell away in green slopes down to a strip of sand, and then the blue Lake Erie, lapping all the way to Canada. The orange patch sky of the steel mill section never reached this part of town. The sky was always blue. We reached Lakeshore Park, a city park laid out with rosebuds, fountains, bowling greens, picnic tables. It was empty now, but sweetly expectant of clean, white, well-behaved children and their parents who played there. Above the lake in the summer, before half running, half stumbling down the slope to the welcoming water. Black people were not allowed in the park, so it filled our dreams. And so, just like now, when my sister read that, I was reduced to tears. Tyrone was tearing. My sister was tearing by the end because it was resonating with us, not only in the book, but in Toni Morrison's childhood, that we were standing in the park, and a few days before, my sister and I were enjoying the very park that she was forbidden from entering when she was a child. Man, come on, Toni. And so what comes after this in the book, you have, it's Frida and Claudia are on their way. They're looking for Pecola, and they found out that she was at her mother's job. Her mother worked as a domestic servant in the home of some wealthy white folk, and they were going to see Pecola. And so they found her kind of on the back porch, back stoop of this house with a wagon waiting for her mother. Her mother would wash her family's clothes in these white folks' washing machine and then give them to her daughter to put in her wagon to take home, hang up to dry. So this is where we are. Her mom is Mrs. Breedlove. Mrs. Breedlove stuck her head out the door and said, I'm sorry. I just need to keep it real. Trying to... I'm serious. Oh, that's so much better. Mrs. Breedlove stuck her head out the door and said, "What's going on here? Pecola, who are these children?" Pecola said, "That's Frida and Claudia, Mrs. Breedlove. Whose girls are you?" She came all the way out on the stoop. She looked nicer than I'd ever seen her, in her white uniform and her hair in a small pompadour. "Mrs. McTeer's girls, ma'am?" "Oh, yes, live over on 21st Street. Yes, ma'am." "What are you doing way over here?" "Just walking. We came to see Pecola." "Well, you better get on back. You can walk with Pecola. Come on in. I get the wash." We stepped into the kitchen, a large, spacious room. Mrs. Breedlove's skin glowed like taffeta in the reflection of white porcelain, white woodwork, polished cabinets, and brilliant copperware. Odors of meat, vegetables, and something freshly baking mixed with the scent of Fell's naphtha. "I'm gonna get the wash. You all stand stock still right there and don't mess up nothing." She disappeared behind a white swinging door, and we could hear the uneven flap of her footsteps as she descended into the basement. Another door opened, and in walked a little girl, smaller and younger than all of us. She wore a pink sun-back dress and pink fluffy bedroom slippers with 2 bunny ears pointed up from the tips. Her hair was corn yellow and bound in a thick ribbon. When she saw us, fear danced across her face for a second. She looked anxiously around the kitchen. "Where's Polly?" she asked. The familiar violence rose in me. Her calling Mrs. Breedlove Polly, even when Pecola called her own mother Mrs. Breedlove, seemed reason enough to scratch her. "She's downstairs," I said. "Polly," she called. "Look," Frida whispered, "look at that." On the counter near the stove in a silvery pan was a deep dish berry cobbler, the purple juice bursting here and there through crust. We moved closer. "It's still hot," Frida said. Pecola stretched her hand to touch the pan lightly to see if it was hot. "Polly, come here," the little girl called again. It may have been nervousness, awkwardness, but the pan tilted under Pecola's fingers and fell to the floor, splattering blackish blueberries everywhere. Most of the juice splashed on Pecola's legs, and the burn must have been painful, for she cried out and began hopping about just as Mrs. Breedlove entered with a tightly packed laundry bag. In one gallop, she was on Pecola, and with the back of her hand knocked her to the floor. Pecola slid into the pie juice, one leg folding under her. Mrs. Breedlove yanked her up by the arm, slapped her again, and in a voice thin with anger, abused Pecola directly and Frida and me by implication. "Crazy fool, my floor mess. Look what you, get out now. Crazy, my floor. Her words were hotter and darker than the smoking berries, and we backed away in dread. The little girl in pink started to cry. Mrs. Breedlove turned to her. "Hush, baby, hush. Come here. Oh, Lord, look at your dress. Don't cry no more. Polly will change it." She went to the sink and turned tap water on a fresh towel. Over her shoulder, she spit out words to us like rotten pieces of apple. "Pick up that wash and get out of here so I can get this mess cleaned up." Pecola picked up the laundry bag, heavy with wet clothes, and we stepped hurriedly out the door. As Pecola put the laundry bag in the wagon, we could hear Mrs. Breedlove hushing and soothing the tears of the little pink and yellow girl. "Who are they, Polly?" "Don't worry none, baby. You gonna make another pie?" "Course I will." "Who were they, Polly?" "Hush, don't worry none," she whispered, and the honey in her words complemented the sundown spilling on the lake. So, look, now I can't see y'all. So, this right here, I feel, is a really perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, about how Morrison really honed in on the weight of oppression on Black people, even when white folks are not present. That child, probably 3 or 4 years old, she wasn't out there impressing nobody. She wasn't making no rules, laws. She wasn't in a cruiser policing Black neighborhoods. But it's the system that had been created. And here these 3 little Black girls understanding that their life is not as valuable as her life. That her daughter, Pecola, is scalding, is burning from her legs. She got smacked into next week, but yet it's this little white girl who her mother has to comfort. When I first read this as a child, Mrs. Breedlove was everything but a daughter of God, okay? But as an older woman, I understand that she had swift choices that she needed to make in that moment. Because if she did not reassure that little girl, that little pink and yellow girl, that she was superior, that her comfort mattered most, that she was going to take care of her and make her feel all right again, ain't no telling what could have happened to her, Mrs. Breedlove, or to those 3 little Black girls. What if Polly would have told her parents because she was so upset and couldn't calm down? Then her parents would have known that these 3 Black girls was in their kitchen, that Mrs. Breedlove, how dare she wash her Black family's clothes in the same washing machine that she washed their white family's clothes. And so this is the system that even made Mrs. Breedlove turn on her own child. And Toni Morrison is brilliant in showing that. I just came from church, so I wanted to end that with an amen. But my next, I'm gonna move on from there, and I'm gonna go to Beloved. And I know that that's a book that people tell me, like when I told people I was gonna do this book, they were like, "Why? It's so hard. We can't understand it. No one understands it." And I'm like, "Get it together," you know. But I understand why, because this book, we're dealing with some supernatural in this book, and that's not always easy. So I wanted to do this book because this book also intersects with me personally. It was when I was in high school, which was around the time that this book was published, although I was not aware of it, you know, because, I mean, it was 1987. Anyway, when my social studies teacher told me the story of Margaret Garner, I don't know if you are aware of her story. I see some nods. And so Margaret Garner was an enslaved woman in Kentucky, Boone County to be exact. It's the county right next to the one that I grew up in Kentucky. And it was during the time of slavery. And Margaret Garner, along with her husband and her children and some other black families, decided they were done with this whole slave system, and we out, you know. And so Margaret's husband stole some horses and some wagons from the plantation owner, and they hit the road. And of course the objection was to cross the Ohio River into Ohio. Nature was on their side. It was the dead of winter. It hadn't been that cold in that area in about 60 years. So when they got to the edge, you know, of the Ohio River right there around Covington, where I grew up at, they decided we're going to ditch the horses and wagon, and we're just going to walk across this river on foot. As a child, I walked across that bridge over the Ohio River many times. And I was filled with dread. So I can't imagine what it would have been like to walk across the actual river. When they get to the other side, they split up, and Margaret Garner and her family go stay with her free uncle, who had been enslaved but was now free. They go stay with her. But unfortunately, the slave catchers was on their trail. And so they catch up with them at her uncle's house, and they are upon the house. They are descending upon the house, like in the front yard, you know, and her husband and some other black men that were with them armed themselves. We're not going down without a struggle. But when Margaret knew that, yeah, the jig is up, we're caught, you know, we are caught, she was like, ain't no way I'm gonna let my children go back into slavery. So she decided that I'm gonna kill them, and then I'm going to kill myself. She only she only was able to relieve her daughter Mary. She had 2 girls and a boy. She was only able to relieve her daughter Mary of that fate, and she killed her and was on her way in the process of the other 2 when the slave catchers and the local authorities burst in and arrest her. And so that story, and I'm gonna leave her story there because that's the part that inspired this book in Beloved. So in Beloved, we have Seth, and Seth is a woman who, this book is staged in Cincinnati right after slavery, in the years after slavery. Seth and other people other black people in that neighborhood were former slaves. A lot of them were former slaves. And while still in captivity, Seth made this same decision with a child of hers. And so in Beloved, we have Seth, her daughter Denver, who was born free. And then we have Beloved, the entity who appears. And we find out later that the entity is the spiritual yet fleshly embodiment of the ghost of the child that Seth killed many, many years ago. And it is sucking the life out of her. And so the whole book just shows how it is sucking the life out of Seth. As Beloved grows stronger, Seth grows weaker. And then Beloved gets pregnant, and supernatural, right? And so what I love about the end of this book is that Toni Morrison shows us, better than tells us, shows us that sometimes we are dealing with things that are so much beyond our control. We need our community to come and save us. We need our community to speak for us and to act for us. And so at the end here, she shows how this community swings into action. And in that description, she adds other descriptions in there of other things. I'm going to skip over those other things because I want you to get this part about community as one piece, okay? So Denver had made the brave choice to seek help outside of her family. She had never hardly ever left the house, but she kind of had an idea of what was happening between her mother and beloved, and she could not fight that alone. She was still a kid. So she starts to seek help from the outside, got a job because Seth stopped taking care of her because she was only concerned about this ghostly preacher, beloved. And so she reached out, and she ended up talking to a woman in the community and telling her everything that was going on. And this is where I'll start reading. The news that Janie got hold of spread among other colored women. Seth's dead daughter, the ones whose throat she cut, had come back to fix her. Seth was worn down, speckled, dying, spinning, changing shapes, and generally bedeviled. That this daughter beat her, tied her to the bed, and pulled out all her hair. It took them days to get the story properly blown up and themselves agitated, and then to calm down and assess the situation. They fell into three groups: those that believed the worst, and those that believed none of it, and those like Ella who thought it through. Ella, what's all this I'm hearing about Seth? Tell me it's in there. That's all I know. The daughter, the killed one, that's what they tell me. How they know it's her? It's sitting there, sleeps, eat, and raises hell, whipping Seth every day. I'll be a baby? No, grown, the age it would have been had it lived. You talking about flesh? I'm talking about flesh. Whipping her like she's batter. Guess she had it coming. Nobody got that coming. But Ella, but nothing. What's fair isn't always right. You can't jump up and kill your children. No, and the children can't jump up and kill the mama. It was Ella, more than anyone, who convinced the others that rescue was in order. Whatever Seth had done, Ella didn't like the idea of past errors taking possession of the present. Seth's crime was staggering, and her pride outstripped even that. But she could not countenance the possibility of sin moving on in the house, unleashed and sassy. Daily life took as much as she had. The future was sunset, the past something to leave behind. And if it didn't stay behind, well, you might have to stomp it out. Slave life, free life, every day was a test and a trial. Nothing could be counted on in a world where even when you are a solution, you are a problem. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. And nobody needed more. Nobody needed a grown-up evil sitting at the table with a grudge. As long as the ghost showed out from its ghostly place, shaking stuff, crying and stuff, Ella respected it. But if it took flesh and came in her world, well, the shoe was on the other foot. She didn't mind a little communication between worlds, but this was an invasion. Shall we pray? Asked the women. Said Ella. First, then we got to get down to business. Some brought what they could and what they believed would work, stuffed in apron pockets, strung around their necks, lying in the space between their breasts. Others brought Christian faith as shield and sword. Most brought Stone Road and came together at the agreed upon time. The heat kept a few women who promised to go at home, others who believed the story didn't want any part of the confrontation and wouldn't have come no matter what the weather. And there were those like Lady Jones who didn't believe the story and hated the ignorance of those who did. So 30 women made up that company and walked slowly toward 124. Denver heard rumbling and looked to the left. She stood when she saw them. They grouped, murmuring and whispering, but did not step foot in the yard. Denver waved. A few waved back, but came no closer. Denver sat back down, wondering what was going on. A woman dropped to her knees. Half of the others did likewise. Denver saw lowered heads, but could not hear the lead prayer, only the earnest symbols of agreement that backed it. Yes, yes, oh yes, hear me, do it, Maker, do it. Yes, among those not on their knees, who stood holding 124 in a fixed glare, was Ella, trying to see through the walls behind the door to what was really in there. Was it true the dead daughter came back, or a pretend? Was it whipping Seth? Then Ella hollered. Instantly, the kneelers and standers joined her. They stopped praying and took a step back to the beginning. In the beginning, there were no words. In the beginning was the sound, and they knew what that sound sounded like. When the women assembled outside 124, Seth was breaking a lump of ice into chunks. She dropped the ice pick into her apron pocket to scoop the pieces into the basin of water. When the music entered the window, she was wringing a cool cloth to put on Beloved's forehead. Beloved, sweating profusely, was sprawled on the bed in the keeping room, a salt rock in her hand. Both women heard it at the same time, and both lifted their heads. As the voices grew louder, Beloved sat up, licked the salt, and went to the bigger room. Seth and she exchanged glances and started toward the window. They saw Denver sitting on the steps, and beyond her, where the yard met the road, they saw the rapt faces of 30 neighborhood women. Some had their eyes closed. Others looked at the hot, cloudless sky. Seth opened the door and reached for Beloved's hand. Together, they stood in the doorway. For Seth, it was as though the clearing had come to her with its heat and simmering leaves, where the voices of women searched for the right combination, the key, the code, the sound that broke the back of words, building voice upon voice until they found it. And when they did, it was a wave of sound wide enough to sound deep water and knock the pods off chestnut trees. It broke over Seth, and she trembled like the baptized in its wash. The singing women recognized Seth at once and surprised themselves by their absence of fear when they saw what stood next to her. The devil child was clever, they thought, and beautiful. It had taken the shape of a pregnant woman, naked and smiling in the heat of the afternoon sun. Thunder black and glistening, she stood on long straight legs, her belly big and tight, vines of her hair twisted all over her head. Jesus, her smile was dazzling. Standing alone on the porch, Beloved is smiling, but now her hand is empty. Seth is running away from her, running, and she feels the emptiness in her hand Seth had been holding. Now Seth is running into the faces of the people out there, joining them and leaving Beloved behind, alone again. And then Denver running too, away from her to the pile of people out there. Right. My God, my God. And so the power of community, and we see that echo in other works of Toni Morrison, and it is a lesson for me. By the time I encountered Beloved, I think I was in graduate school. It probably would have been unwise for me to attempt to read it before then. But it was at a time where I needed community. And that has resonated over my entire life since then, not just as a Black person and a Black woman living in America and needing the power of my community, but also as a writer and needing the community of other writers in general, other Black writers specifically. And so I'm gonna leave you with that. So thank you, Scott Woods. Thank you, Zach and Bexley Library. And thank you, Toni Morrison.
Thank you, Vernell Bristow. That was incredible. We'll take about a 5 to 10 minute break now, so if you have to use the restroom or get water or anything, help yourselves. These books in the back are available for checkout, so you can check something out in the meantime. And we will be back with Dear Miss Stevi. She will be reading at around 2:20, so I'll introduce her, but we have a few minutes right now. Hello, everybody. All right, we're about to bring up our second reader, so if you want to take your seat in about 1 minute or so. So our second reader for today, Stevi Knighton, is a poet, writer, storyteller, and performer. She has hosted the Composition Poetry Night, as well as many other open mic and literary events around Columbus. She writes and performs under the name Dear Miss Stevi and has a passion for local artistic events with a focus on poetry and literary art. So please join me in welcoming Dear Miss Stevi.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't nervous until until you got emotional, and I'm with you 100%. That was amazing. I echo all of the thanks to Scott and the Bexley Public Library, and for all of you being here, and to that magnificent, majestic Toni Morrison, who has influenced me in my writing. I will share a couple original pieces with you today so that you can hopefully see how her writing has influenced, inspired, and even comes up in the pieces that I'll share with you. But my introduction to Toni Morrison was not the editor or the Nobel Nobel Prize winner. She wasn't, to me at first, this amazing, eloquent interviewee of the 21st or 20th century. She wasn't a PhD or professor or even a single mother of 2 boys. She was not even the writer who wrote her first book at 39, which was The Bluest Eye, in the wee hours of the morning while her children slept. Rather, she was introduced to me as a genius and captivating author and one of the most prolific writers of our time. And she was a Black woman who wrote intentionally about Black people. In her writing, she has made us both mystical and human, perhaps to admonish us to believe to be human is to be mystical, and to be Black is to be human, and worthy of having our specific human experience explored. Sula, which is the book that I'll be reading from today. Yes. Okay, we have Sula fans. So this was her second book that she wrote in 1973, and it's a book that I read first at 22, and I was in college, and it was her second novel, like I mentioned. It explores the feminine experience in a new and refreshing way, and it left an everlasting impression on me that has influenced my style of writing and informed my intersectional feminist politic. Throughout my brief time before you, I'll be reading a few stunning, vivid descriptions revealing a master of her craft and incredible ability to paint with words. That is the thing that sticks out for me. Anytime you read or hear any of Morrison's work, the pictures that she's able to paint are just, I haven't seen a movie, even the movie Beloved with all of the fabulous actors and actresses, it pales in comparison to the way that she's able to put words to page and bring every character alive. So I'm just, anyway, it's one of my favorite books. So I'll be reading portions of it that I thought were, that actually reveal that. It's through engaging her work that I find the freedom to relinquish my commitment to being a good poet, and I seek instead to become a good writer using poetic device. I hope you'll be able to follow my journey through this novel, and when sharing my personal original poetry, I hope you can hear Toni's influence and my desire to paint with words, as she has. I encourage you to read Sula and her other prolific works that exemplify her joining of poetry and prose. So I will begin with the beginning. So Sula split into two parts. It explores a number of things, but namely, I would say it explores it from a very female perspective, relationship both with each other and with men, and explores how those relationships play out. It is set in the 1930s in a small town. And I love, this is just an example, I think, of this, her ability to describe a setting and immediately transport you into the time and place where she's writing. So this is part one, it's the beginning of the book. In that place where they tore the nightshade and blackberry patches from their roots to make room for the Medallion City golf course, there once was a neighborhood. It stood in the hills above the valley town of Medallion and spread all the way to the river. It is called the suburbs now, but when Black people lived there, it was called the bottom. One road, shaded by beeches, oaks, maples, and chestnuts, connected it to the valley. The beeches are gone now, and so are the pear trees, where children sat and yelled down through the blossoms to passerby. Generous funds have been allotted to level the stripped and faded buildings that clutter the road from Medallion up to the golf course. They are going to raise the time-and-a-half pool hall where feet in long tan shoes once pointed down from chair rungs. A steel ball will knock to dust Irene's Palace of Cosmetology, where women used to lean their heads back on sink trays and doze while Irene lathered new Nile into their hair. Men in khaki work clothes will pry loose the slats of Reba's grill, where the owner cooked in her hat because she couldn't remember the ingredients without it. There will be nothing left of the bottom. The footbridge that crossed the river is already gone. But perhaps it is just as well, since it wasn't a town anyway, just a neighborhood where on quiet days, people in valley houses could hear singing sometimes, banjos sometimes, and if a valley man happened to have business up in those hills collecting rent or insurance payments, he might see a dark woman in a flowered dress, doing a bit of a cakewalk, a bit of a black bottom, a bit of messing around, to the lively notes of a mouth organ. Her bare feet would raise the saffron dust that floated down on the coveralls and bunion split shoes of the man breathing music in and out of his harmonica. The Black people watching her would laugh and rub their knees, and it would be easy for the valley man to hear the laughter and not notice the adult pain that rested somewhere under the eyelids, somewhere under their head rags and soft felt hats, somewhere in the palm of the hand, somewhere behind the frayed lapels, somewhere in the sinews curve. He'd have to stand in the back of Greater St. Matthew's and let the tenor's voice dress him in silk, or touch the hands of the spoon carvers who had not worked in 8 years, and let the fingers that danced on wood kiss his skin. Otherwise, the pain would escape him, even though the laughter was a part of the pain. I mean, y'all. My goodness. Right? So I'll continue on in the book and introduce the different characters as we go along, because one of the things that I really appreciate about her writing, but specifically this novel, is that she lays out the generational situations that occur that bring our main characters to the women in the places that they are, the main characters being Nell and Sula. And I love the fact that in this book, Nell, as you'll find, is more of the quote-unquote good girl. Sula is not. But instead of the book being named for Nell, it's named for Sula. And you get that understanding and experience from the very beginning when she talks about the adult pain being under the laughter. That is a theme that will run throughout the course of the book that I think is just, anyways. So, I will wait on, actually, I'm going to get into this other part before I do a poem of mine that I think is appropriate for all of this. So we will meet Nell in 1920, because each chapter is a year, so it's a place in time that you're transported to. So Helene is Nell's mother, and in this scene we are introduced to Nell's grandmother. Under Helene's hand, the girl became obedient and polite. Any enthusiasms that little Nell showed were calmed by the mother until she drove her daughter's imagination underground. Helene Wright was an impressive woman, at least in Medallion she was. Heavy hair in a bun, dark eyes arched into a perpetual query about other people's manners. A woman who won all social battles with presence and a conviction of the legitimacy of her authority. To be writing about women in such a way in 1973, set in 1920, I'm sorry, I had to stop and make that point. Since there was no Catholic church in Medallion then, she joined the most conservative Black church and held sway. It was Helene who never turned her head in church when latecomers arrived, Helene who established the practice of seasonal altar flowers, Helene who introduced the giving of banquets of welcome to returning Negro veterans. She lost only one battle, the pronunciation of her name. The people in the bottom refused to say Helene. They called her Helen Wright and left it at that. All in all, her life was a satisfactory one. She loved her house and enjoyed manipulating her daughter and her husband. She would sigh sometimes just before falling asleep, thinking that she had indeed come far enough away from the sundown house. So it was with extremely mixed emotions that she read a letter from Mr. Henry Martin describing the illness of her grandmother. So it was Nell's great-grandmother, I'm sorry. She'll explain that here in a second. And suggesting she come down right away. She didn't want to go, but could not bring herself to ignore the silent plea of the woman who had rescued her. So I'll skip ahead to when they actually meet. Cecile Sabat's house leaned between two others just like it on Elysian Fields. A Frenchified shotgun house, it sported a magnificent garden in the back and a tiny wrought iron fence in the front. On the door hung a black crepe wreath with purple ribbon. They were too late. Helene reached up to touch the ribbon, hesitated, and knocked. A man in a collarless shirt opened the door. Helene identified herself, and he said he was Henry Martin and that he was there for the setting up. They stepped into the house. The Virgin Mary clasped her hands in front of her neck 3 times in the front room and once in the bedroom where Cecile's body lay. The old woman had died without seeing or blessing her granddaughter. No one other than Mr. Martin seemed to be in the house, but a sweet odor, as of gardenias, told them that someone else had been. Blotting her lashes with a white handkerchief, Helene walked through the kitchen to the back bedroom where she had slept for 16 years. Nell trotted along behind, enchanted with the smell, the candles, and the strangeness. When Helene bent to loosen the ribbons of Nell's hat, a woman in a yellow dress came out of the garden and onto the back porch that opened into the bedroom. The two women looked at each other. There was no recognition in the eyes of either. Then Helene said, "This is your grandmother, Nell." Nell looked at her mother and then quickly back at the door they had just come out of. "No, that was your great-grandmother." That passed. "This is your grandmother, my mother." Before the child could think, her words were hanging in the gardenia air. "But she looks so young, don't we all?" The woman in the canary yellow dress laughed and said she was 48, an old 48. Then it was she who carried the gardenia smell, this tiny woman with the softness and glare of a canary in that somber house that held 4 Virgin Marys, where death sighed in every corner and candles sputtered. The gardenia smell and canary yellow dress emphasized the funeral atmosphere surrounding them. So now, right before we meet Sula, I would like to share a piece that I think I wrote this about female relationships. I wrote this poem after spending time with some friends, and 2 of the friends were no longer in relationship, but we managed in that moment for about 30 minutes to hang out in the car as if nothing could happen, or nothing had happened, and probably both, because there was a sanctuary that we had created among ourselves. And I think Sula also gets to the root of that, and also to the root of when those kinds of relationships come undone. So this is actually an excerpt because the full poem is on my EP and has a little bit of cussing in it, and I didn't want to do that here at the Bexley Library. So, I'm just going to read an excerpt, and you are welcome to listen to the full version on my EP. It's called Ride or Die. For a minute, we were women. We were just us, sitting in the car, sharing you loud talking, us laughing, no beef, no memory of smashed dishes, glasses smashed, and it was a bad day, watching you haunted and hauled away. For a minute, we were just girls, articulate and raunchy, funny, bold speak. We inherited our speech from grandmothers who raised men, grew them up like living room ferns, like plants with only the best sunlight, like gods, like creators. We debate death and win every time, just women, uninhibited, unafraid of bold speak, seeking out validation only in ourselves, amongst ourselves, base desires, sex, sleep, drink, eat, ended with a laugh, a long thunder, a sound, a hearing, a justice fought for, a freedom. And now we meet Sula. Thank you. Sula Peace lived in a house of many rooms that had been built over a period of 5 years to the specifications of its owner, who kept on adding things, more stairways. There were 3 sets to the second floor, more rooms, doors, and stoops. There were rooms that had 3 doors, others that opened out onto the porch only and were inaccessible from any other part of the house, others that you could get to only by going through somebody's bedroom. The creator and sovereign of this enormous house with the 4 sickle pear trees in the front yard and the single elm in the backyard was Eva Peace, who sat in a wagon on the 3rd floor directing the lives of her children, friends, strays, and a constant stream of boarders. Fewer than 9 people in the town remembered when Eva had 2 legs, and her oldest child, Hannah, was not one of them. Unless Eva herself introduced the subject, No one ever spoke of her disability. They pretended to ignore it, unless in some mood of fancy, she began some fearful story about it, generally to entertain children. How the leg got up by itself one day and walked on off. How she hobbled after it, but it ran too fast. Or how she had a corn on her toe and it just grew and grew and grew until her whole foot was a corn, and then it traveled on up her leg and wouldn't stop growing until she put a red rag at the top, but by that time it was already at her knee. After 5 years of a sad and disgruntled marriage, Boy took off. That was Hannah, her eldest child, Eva's oldest child, and Boy, I think. I'm not making a mistake. Sorry, y'all. Trying to get to the part where we learn a little bit more about the women in Sula's life and their way of doing things, which was a little different with the borders and the type of home that Sula grew up in and the way in which they did community or practice. It was just, it's a stark difference between she and Nell's upbringing. Although what we see is a theme of the way that our mothers shape our view of our relationships, both with ourselves and with our significant others. So throughout the book, you see how Nell's life is often influenced by her mother, who we can kind of tell, for lack of a better phrase, was like a piece of work, right? She enjoyed manipulating her daughter. And then you also see throughout the book how Sula's upbringing, a little different, with women who were less traditional, who laughed and played and did all of these things. Even though Nell's grandmother did the same, you begin to kind of understand that there is a undercurrent of what you're supposed to do, who you're supposed to be, what is acceptable, and then what is not. So we'll keep going, and I wanted to bring to your attention, sorry, I lost my place, guys. Okay, so here we go. We're gonna kind of fast forward to where we find out kind of what the women with Hannah and Sula and the townspeople kind of thought about them, because they were very much, if your husband likes me, it don't matter if he your husband type of women. And the fury she created in the women of the town was incredible, for she would lay their husbands once and then no more. Hannah had been a nuisance, but she was complimenting the women, in a way, by wanting their husbands. Sula was trying them out and discarding them without any excuse the men could swallow. So the women, to justify their own judgment, cherished their men more, soothed the pride and vanity Sula had bruised. Among the weighty evidence piling up was the fact that Sula did not look her age. She was near 30, and unlike them, had lost no teeth, suffered no bruises, developed no ring of fat at the waist or pocket at the back of her neck. It was rumored that she had had no childhood diseases, was never known to have chickenpox, croup, or any other, or not even a runny nose. She had played rough as a child, but where were the scars? Except for a funny-shaped finger and that evil birthmark, she was free of any normal signs of vulnerability. Toni just wrote about a superhero. For a 22-year-old who's reading this, who grew up, I'm a millennial, so 90s, 2000s. I grew up very much with a woman who was a woman of the 90s. That was meant to be, she was independent and didn't need a man for nothing. And you got your own money and took care of yourself and got an education and did the things. Oh, sorry, y'all. I'm nervous. So I often would consider the type of person that Sula was, and at 22 knew, even as I did as a child, that I was not that kind of girl. I definitely wanted love and a fairy tale and all of the things. And yes, I'm going to get an education. And yes, Mom, I'll travel. And yes, and I want a family and I want a man. And so reading this at 22 and confronting and encountering a character that so boldly possessed her own sense of self and sexuality was, it was a new concept even at 22. Because while in college and at that age, you think you're supposed to be exploring and expanding and, folks think you kind of go crazy and party and all of those things, it was still very much frowned upon. It was still, you still didn't want to be one of those quote unquote girls. You still didn't want to be fast because then you wouldn't be acceptable. You wouldn't be marriage material. You wouldn't be wifey material is what they used to say. And really, it meant that you were restricted to the male gaze. So I had to make note of that Sula was just different. She was very self-possessed. So this particular chapter goes on to describe the ways in which the women in the town or the neighborhood are very displeased with her and how they felt she was legitimately evil. And so their evidence against Sula was not contrived, but their conclusions about her, their evidence against Sula was contrived, but their conclusions about her were not. Sula was distinctly different. Eva's arrogance and Hannah's self-indulgence merged in her, and with a twist that was all her own imagination, she lived out her days, exploring her own thoughts and emotions, giving them full rein, feeling no obligation to please anybody unless their pleasure pleased her. Once again, this is being written in 1973, and this particular chapter is 1939. So imagine a woman in 1939 who doesn't care about what you think, how you feel, and is thoroughly invested in her internal world and growing herself. So again, this is a superhero. In the midst of a pleasant conversation with someone, she might say, "Why do you chew with your mouth open?" Not because the answer interested her, but because she wanted to see the person's face change rapidly. She was completely free of ambition with no affection for money, property, or things, no greed, no desire to command attention or compliments, no ego. For that reason, she felt no compulsion to verify herself, be consistent with herself. She had clung to Nell as the closest thing to both an other and a self, only to discover that she and Nell were not one and the same. She had no thought at all of causing Nell pain when she bedded down with Jude. Jude was Nell's husband. They had always shared the affection of other people, compared how a boy kissed, what line he used with one and then the other. Marriage apparently had changed all that, but having had no intimate knowledge of marriage, having lived in a house with women who thought all men were available and selected from among them with a care only for their taste, she was ill-prepared for the possessiveness of the one person she felt close to. So she and Nell are best friends. And Nell, being the good girl that she is, goes on and does the good girl thing. And Sula, having no concept or no care, really, for what that meant, only knowing that she felt very close to her, she was still her best friend, she didn't understand she didn't see the marriage or the man itself as being anything that would have to alter or change their relationship, because she didn't think that would be anything that would change anything about herself or her life. Nell was just an extension of who she was. And then if you think about it from the perspective of not being tied to her ego, that's actually a really beautiful thing. She cared so deeply about herself, her own convictions, and exploring her internal world, and saw her best friend as an extension of that. So you can see how her relationship to Nell is a little bit different than Nell's relationship and understanding of what friendship is. So because they explore a lot of themes about, and I think now is a good time to kind of introduce another original work that I did that's called Southern Trees. And it's about the lasting impressions and influences that specifically mothers leave on their communities and their children. And that is also, since we are in Black History Month and Toni Morrison both advocated and obviously explored the Black experience in her work, there is kind of a double meaning in this poem that I'll let you draw for yourselves. So this is called Southern Trees. Poor tree. A mother spirit lives there, sending messages through roots and mushrooms. Damned tree, made to be complicit in unspeakable acts, holding the weight and secrets of the dead. This witness and reluctant executioner, a mother spirit lives there, transferring gas into oxygen so we can breathe, bearing witness to the last innocent breath. Poor tree, bitter fruit it didn't bear on its own, didn't bear on its boughs, but standing anyway, because what else do trees do? What else are they good for? Poor trees, another spirit lives there, a spirit seeking hugs and love lost to this world, dead inside. Poor tree, roots all dried, choked by blood and unholy fertilizer, seeping down to cover the ground in sin and violence. Poor tree, cut down for its reminder, for its memory, for its story, for its history of being there, always being there, silent, stoic, like a mother. I chose that because, again, I like to think about the ways we as parents are still complicit in the upbringing and the shaping of our children and their attitudes, especially mothers and daughters. And it's evident through the lives of both Nell and Sula. So this part of the book I love because this is when Sula actually encounters Ajax. And this is a man that does a little something to Sula because she's not heartless, right? She's still human. And that's what I loved is that just like any good superhero, there's still a kryptonite. And Sula kind of arrives at this place where she recognizes some form of love for this man, and that relationship does not work out. And she essentially, being the introspective person that she is, really considers his presence and now his absence. Every now and then, she looked around for tangible evidence of his having ever been there. Where were the butterflies, the blueberries, the whistling reed? She could find nothing, for he had left nothing but his stunning absence. An absence so decorative, so ornate, it was difficult for her to understand how she had ever endured without falling dead or being consumed his magnificent presence. So when she spends this time, she starts really thinking about his absence. I want to just skip down because I thought this was so awesome. But what is this? She's asking. Albert Jacks, his name was Albert Jacks, Ajax. She had thought it was Ajax. All those years, even from the time she walked by the pool hall and looked away from him sitting astride a wooden chair, looked away to keep from seeing the wide space of intolerable orderliness between his legs, the openness that held no sign at all of the animal that lurked in his trousers, looked away from the insolent nostrils and the smile that kept slipping and falling, so she wanted to reach out with her hand to catch it before it fell to the pavement and was sullied by the cigarette butts and bottle caps and spittle at his feet and the feet of other men who sat or stood out round the outside the pool hall, calling, singing out to her and Nell, and grown women too, with lyrics that were a little fresh. So I'll skip down again as she is recounting who this man really was, who she thought she loved, and recognizing that she didn't even really know his name. Sula stood with a worn slip of paper in her fingers and said aloud to no one, "I didn't even know his name. And if I didn't know his name, then there is nothing I did know. And I have known nothing ever at all, since the one thing I wanted was to know his name. So how could he help but leave me, since he was making love to a woman who didn't even know his name?" When I was a little girl, the heads of my paper dolls came off, and it was a long time before I discovered that my own head would not fall off if I bent my neck. I just love that part. So the last portion of Sula that I'll jump down to, of course, and I mentioned before Nella and Sula's relationship and how it was changed and altered because Sula bedded Jude, and broke Nell's heart. And then obviously Sula having experienced Ajax, but also having an understanding of what that relationship was and her and Nell's relationship. We find that Sula ends up ill, and Nell actually comes to check on her. And I mean, obviously, not just to check on her as a friend, but also because how could my friend do this to me? And I think she is also just seeking out information from Sula and wanting to understand how they got there. So Nell enters into the home and is asking Sula if she needs anything and what she can do for her. "Where is it?" Nell was glad to have a concrete errand. Conversation would be difficult. Trust Sula to pick up a relationship exactly where it lay. "Look in my bag." "No, over there." Nell walked to the dresser and opened the purse with the beaded clasp. She saw only a watch and the folded prescription down inside. No wallet, no change purse. She turned to Sula. "Where's your—" But Sula was looking at the boarded up window. Something in her eye right there in the corner stopped Nell from completing her question. That and the slight flare of the nostrils, a shadow of a snarl. Nell took the piece of paper and picked up her own purse, saying, "Okay, I'll be right back." So Nell is going off to run an errand for Sula, and then finally really, builds up the courage when she comes back to have a conversation with her. And so they begin to talk, and this is this quote right here. I'm going to read a last piece that actually incorporates what she says right here between Nell and Sula. So, and then I'll pick up in their conversation. "There's something to say for it, Sula, especially if you don't want people to have to do for you. Neither one, Nellie, neither one. You can't have it all, Sula." Nell was getting exasperated with her arrogance, with her lying at death's door, still smart talking. "Why? I can do it all. Why can't I have it all? You can't do it all. You a woman and a colored woman at that. You can't act like a man. You can't be walking around all independent like, doing whatever you like, talking what you want, leaving what you don't. You repeating yourself." "How repeating myself? You say I'm a woman and colored. Ain't that the same as being a man?" "I don't think so, and you wouldn't either if you had children. Then I really would act like what you call a man. Every man I ever knew left his children." "Some were taken." "Wrong, Nellie. The word is left. You still going to know everything, ain't you?" "I don't know everything. I just do everything." Well, you don't do what I do. You think I don't know what your life is? Like just because I ain't living it? I know what every colored woman in this country is doing." "What's that?" "Dying, just like me. But the difference is they dying like a stump. Me, I'm going down like one of those redwoods. I sure did live in this world." "Really? What have you got to show for it?" "Show? To who?" "Girl, I got my mind and what goes on in it, which is to say, I got me." "Lonely, ain't it?" "Yes, but my lonely is mine. Now your lonely is somebody else's, made by somebody else and handed to you. Ain't that something? A secondhand lonely." I'll end there in the book and let you guys please read Sula on your own, because I skipped a bunch of parts with that intention. But man, if nothing else shows, even to the very end, the relationship between those two women and Sula's commitment to herself. So as a 22-year-old and now as a recently turned 40-year-old, it still is a reminder that being myself is much more important than being good, because myself is good enough. And I think that oftentimes we as women and colored women forget that our worth is inherent, and we do not need to prove to anyone our worth or our value or our goodness. We don't need to be like Helene and hold a certain status. We don't necessarily need to be like Sula's people either, like Eve, and make light of things that cause us pain and change our life. That undercurrent of pain in the laughter is a part of our lives, but we can talk about it, we can express it, and I have chosen to do so in poetry. This is my last piece before I leave the podium. Thank you so much for your attention and patience with me and my nerves. This is called Hopeless Romantic. I realize I don't know butterflies. Sorry. I know gravel churning in my gut, heavy with the weight of deception. I know a pit in my stomach, tripping over my own intuition as I fall for you. I know the knowing, the gnawing feeling after hearing the doublespeak in your words, even if I doubt the damage they can do, bracing myself for the truth. I know the habits, the patterns that won't let me go, the ways in which I do the dance of seduction, knowing what I know and still playing the fool. It's a role I've grown accustomed to, and the shame that goes with it, my personal scarlet tattoo of a bleeding heart right on my sleeve. I know heartbreak intimately. I know secondhand lonely firsthand, and should have listened to Toni. I know these types of verses too well, pain woven into lyric and song and rhyme. I've heard it called the blues in brilliant prose, poetry sublime, and bright with the oxygen of a fresh wound. Only the wounded cry out, and oh, what a beautiful tune. Terrible to have to sing, but one of the only ways to get out the hole in your gut. I know you. I know the me I become with you. The cuts you cause feel better than my own razor, a pain to distract myself from the despair of being the writer. Yes, the writer even of my own destiny, the creator and arbiter and sole possessor of such responsibility. So I use you to hurt me and remind me that I'm alive, still a tree, and not just paper to be written on. A story about butterflies and that time you gave them to me to ground me and bring me back to earth. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Stevi DearMsStevi Knighton. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We'll take another really quick break, and we'll be back here about 3:10 with our next reader, Donna Marbury. So take a break, and please get back here in about 10 minutes or so. All right, everybody, we are going to get started with our next reader. Donna Marbury oversaw the creative direction and was the editor for the Art Activism Action Book, which was a collaboration with the Greater Columbus Arts Council and Warhol and Wall Street that captured... Sorry. Thank you, Vernell. And if you haven't seen this is an incredible book that captured the art and historic moment of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement around Columbus. Donna is a storyteller, writer, journalist who is published in Columbus Monthly, Columbus CEO, Columbus Alive, Columbus Dispatch, Chicago Music, and All Hip Hop, among many other publications. So I'll turn it over to Donna, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Hello, can y'all hear me? All right, thank you so much. This has been such an amazing event so far. Thank you for the ladies for warming up this conversation. Thank you for Bexley Library for inviting me to be here. And so I got the call from Scott Woods to be a part of this program. And when he called me, I had actually been thinking a lot about writers and Black women and how we document our creative processes. So I had recently received this book that I highly recommend. It's called Black Women Writers at Work. It's by Claudia Tate. It was originally printed in 1983, and it had been out of print for years. Like, you could get it, but it's like over $75, and that wasn't in my writing budget. So, you know, I mean, out of the blue, a friend of mine bought it for me last year, and it was reprinted in 2023. So I had been clinging to this book for a couple of weeks. The book is by a Black woman critic, and it's about Black women writers. And so, like I said, I've been thinking a lot about how Black women artists are documented. Now, I'm someone who loves to read about creative process. I love the Paris Review. I will read your autobiography. Like, I just love creative process. And so, you know, I haven't researched this, but I feel like Toni Morrison may be the most documented Black woman when it comes to the respect for her creative process. And one thing I appreciate about Beyonce, now I'm not about to compare Beyonce to Toni Morrison. So, put y'all tomatoes away, okay? But what I appreciate about her is her commitment to documenting herself as a creative genius. Because often when you see a Black woman artist who's interviewed, they talk about everything, what she's wearing, who she's sleeping with, any industry beef, anything. And this is regardless of the art platform. This happens to writers, singers, etc. So, you know, as you know, Toni Morrison has a lot of interviews. A lot of people have had the opportunity to sit down with her. And she gives a lot of information and her input on the thoughts and the culture of writing. So it was important for me today to share an interview that she gave with another Black woman. So a couple of weeks ago, I kind of bombarded my dear friend Taisha Radford Shorts here in the coffee shop and said, hey, will you sit on the stage with me? And she's like, yeah, just send me an invite, sis. So here we are today. Taisha is an amazing writer and historian in her own right. And so I'm just happy that you are joining me today. And we're going to read a portion of an interview from this book. And then Taisha's going to share some thoughts as well. And then we're going to read another interview. So.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes, that's good. Okay.
All right.
How does being Black and female constitute a particular perspective in your work?
When I view the world, perceive it, and write about it, it's the world of Black people. It's not that I won't write about white people. I just know that when I'm trying to develop the various themes I write about, the people who best manifest those themes for me are Black people whom I invent. It's not deliberate or calculated or self-consciously Black, because I recognize and despise the artificial Black writing some writers do. I feel them slumming among Black people. When I wrote Sula, I knew I was going to write a book about good and evil and about friendship. I had to figure out what kind of people would manifest this theme, would have this kind of relationship. Nell would be one kind of person, as we just found out, and Sula would be different. Friendship between women is special, different, and has never been depicted as the major focus of a novel before Sula. Nobody ever talked about friendship between women unless it was homosexual, and there is no homosexuality in Sula. Relationships between women were always written about as though they were subordinate to some other roles they were playing. This is not true of men. It seemed to me that Black women have friends in the old-fashioned sense of the word. Perhaps this isn't true just for Black people, but it seems so to me. I was halfway through the book before I realized that friendship, in literary terms, is a rather contemporary idea. So when I was making up people in Sula, it was inevitable I would focus on Black women, not out of ignorance of any other kind of people, but because they are compelling interest to me.
Do you consciously select towns like Lorain, Ohio, as settings for your stories?
Only the Bluest Eye, my first book, is set in Lorain, Ohio. In the others, I was more interested in mood than in geography. I am from the Midwest, so I have a special affection for it. My beginnings are always there. No matter what I write, I begin there. I may abandon this focus at some point, but for now, it's the matrix for me. Black people take their culture wherever they go. If I wrote about Maine, the Black people in Maine would be very much like the Black people in Ohio. You can change the plate, but the menu would still be the same. The barbershop in Maine would still be the same kind of barbershop as in Ohio. There would be the same kind of people sitting around. They cook a little bit differently, but I know what the language will be like.
Ohio is an interesting and complex state.
We're gonna end there.
It has both a southern and a northern disposition. The Ohio River has historically represented freedom. Therefore, the state seems to be especially well suited for staging leaps in the Song of Solomon and free falls in Sula into freedom.
Yes. The northern part of the state had underground railroad stations and a history of Black people escaping into Canada. But the southern part of the state is as much Kentucky as there is, complete with the cross burnings. Ohio is a curious juxtaposition of what was ideal in this country and what was base. It is also a mecca for Black people. They came to the mills and plants because Ohio offered the possibility of good life, the possibility of freedom, even though there was some terrible obstacles. Ohio also offers an escape from stereotyped Black settings. It is neither plantation nor ghetto.
How do you fit writing into your life?
This is like a very interesting, for the writers in the audience. Just soak this in from our dear Toni. Time has never been a problem for me.
Right?
Okay, I don't do much. I don't go out, I don't entertain, and I get off the phone. Those activities demand an enormous part of what people call time. In addition, I can do two things at once. Most of the things I do, I know how to do, so I don't have to concentrate on them, give them my full attention. And they don't suffer the consequence. There's very little one does that engages the full mind for a long period of time. In a sense, we all produce time, but when we compartmentalize our lives, then we complain about time. We say this is the time to do this is the time we do that. Then we feel we have to do things in some sort of sequence. Writing is a process that goes on all the time. I can find myself in any place solving some problem in the work that I am at in the moment working on. I don't have to summon it. It's just a way of life, so there's never a time when I'm writing a book when it's not on my mind. I live with it. But there are times when I have to sit down and write. The difficulty comes in not having sustained periods of time, 4 or 5 hours at a clip. I have more of that now, but the trick is to get where I want to be very fast in the writing. So I can avoid 3 hours of frustration, clumsy writing. I have done it if I produce 6 pages during such times.
Do you employ particular methods to summon your muse?
When I sit down in order to write, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. This is the part. This is the part. Okay, if you don't remember anything else, this is the part. But that doesn't bother me anymore. I tell my students there is no such thing as writer's block, and they should respect it. You shouldn't write through it. It's blocked because it ought to be blocked, because you haven't got it right now. All the frustrations and nuttiness that comes from, oh my God, I can't write now, should be displaced. It's just a message to you saying, that's right, you can't write now, so don't. Like, that's the part. Yes. We operate with deadlines, so facing the anxiety about the block has become a way of life. We get frightened about the fear. I can't write like that. If I don't have anything to say for 3 or 4 months, I just don't write. Wow. Yeah. 3 or 4 months.
Thank you, Toni. Thank you. This is the second part. Okay. When I read a book, I can always tell if the writer has written through a block. If he or she had just waited, it would have been better or different or a little more natural. Wow. You can see the seams. I always know the story when I'm working on a book. That's not difficult. Anybody can think up a story, but trying to breathe life into characters, allow them space, make them people whom I care about is hard. I only have 26 letters of the alphabet. I don't have color or music. I must use my craft to make the reader see the colors and hear the sounds. My stories come to me as cliches. A cliche is a cliche because it's worthwhile. Otherwise, it would have been discarded. A good cliche can never be overwritten. It's still mysterious. The concepts of beauty and ugliness are mysterious to me. Many people write about them. In mulling over them, I try to get underneath them and see what they mean, understand the impact that they have on people and what they do. I also write about love and death. The problem I face as a writer is to make my stories mean something. You can have wonderful, interesting people, a fascinating story, but it's not about anything. It has no real substance. I can fail in a number of ways when I write, but I want my books to always be about something that is important to me, and the subjects that are important in the world are the same ones that have always been important. Critics generally don't associate Black people with ideas. They see marginal people. They just see another story about Black folks. They regard the whole thing as sociological, interesting, perhaps, but very parochial. There's a notion out in the land that there are human beings ones write about, and then there are Black people, or Indians, or some other marginal group. If you write about the world from that point of view, somehow it's considered lesser. It's racist, of course. The fact that I choose to write about Black people means I've only been stimulated to write about Black people. We are people, not aliens. We live, we love, and we die. A woman wrote a book on women writers, and she has an apology in the preface in which she explains why the book doesn't include any Black women writers. She says she doesn't feel qualified to criticize their work. I think that's dishonest scholarship. I may be wrong, but I think so. And I took trouble to tell her that. I took the trouble. Okay?
It's the petty for me.
Said that again. All right. I feel perfectly qualified to discuss Emily Dickinson, anybody for that matter, because I assume what Jane Austen and all those people have to say has something to do with the life and being human in the world. Why she could not figure out that preoccupation of Black characters is this as well startled me, as though our lives are so exotic that the differences are incomprehensible. Okay, this is my part, okay? This is my moment, okay? Insensitive white people cannot deal with Black writing, but then they cannot deal with their own literature either. It's not a question of my not liking white criticism. I don't like most Black criticism either. Most criticism by Blacks only respond to the impetus of the criticism we were all taught in college. It justifies itself by identifying Black writers with some already accepted white writer. If someone says I write like Joyce, that's giving me a kind of credibility I find offensive. It has nothing to do with my liking Joyce. I do, but the comparison has to do nothing out of which I write. I find such criticism dishonest because it never goes into the work on its own terms. It comes from some other place and finds content outside of the work and wholly irrelevant to it to support the work. You can hear them talking to Northrop Frye, and you can hear his response. You can also hear a novelist talking to the New York Times, and not to me, the anonymous reader. The criticism may read well, in fact, very well, but it's not about the book at hand. It's merely trying to place the book into an already established literary tradition. The critic is too frightened and too uninformed to break new ground.
What is your responsibility as a writer to yourself and to your audience?
I wrote Sula and The Bluest Eye because they were books I wanted to read. No one had written them yet, so I wrote them. The audience is always the people in the book I'm writing at the time. I don't think of an external audience. You can see it when a writer is writing deliberately to educate an audience. You can feel the artifice, not the art. When the writer is getting somebody told.
Okay, this is when we shift gears a little bit. Do Black men and women approach subjects differently in their works?
Okay. I think women probably do write out of a different place. There's some difference in the ways they approach conflict, dominion, and power. I don't find the large differences between male and female writing in the terms of intimacy, though. But I do think Black women write differently from white women. This is the most marked difference of all the combinations of Black and white and male and female. It's not so much that women write differently from men, but that Black women write differently from white women. Black men don't write very differently from white men. It seems that there's an enormous difference in the writing of Black and white women. Aggression is not new to Black women as it is to white women. Black women seem able to combine the nest and the adventure. They don't see conflicts in certain areas as do white women. They are both safe harbor and ship. They are both in and trail. We as Black women do both. We don't find these places, these roles, mutually exclusive. That's one of the differences. White women often find if they leave their husbands or go out in the world, it's an extraordinary event. If they've settled for the benefits of housewifery that preclude a career, then it's marriage or career for them, not both, not and. It would be interesting to do a piece on the kinds of work women do in novels written by women. What kind of jobs do they do? Not just the paying jobs, but how they perceive work. When white women characters get depressed about the dishes, what do they do? It's not just a question of being in the labor force and doing domestic kinds of things. It's about how one perceives work and how it fits into one's life. There's a male-female thing that's also different in the works of Black and white women writers, and this difference is good. There's a special kind of domestic perception that has its own violence in writing by Black women. Not bloody violence, but violence nonetheless. Love, in the Western notion, is full of possession, distortion, and corruption. It's a slaughter without the blood. Men always want to change things, and women probably don't. I don't think it has much to do with the women's powerlessness. Change could be death. You don't have to change everything. Some things should just be the way they are. Change in itself is not so important, but men see it as important. Under the guise of change and love, you destroy all sorts of things, each other, children. You move things around and put them in special places. I remember when I was in elementary school, there were all sorts of people in my class. The mentally defective, the handicapped to us. To improve that situation, the school removed all the people and put them in special classes. Perhaps they were better cared for, but they were not among us. There's an enormous amount a sighted child can learn from a blind child, but when you separate them, the learning becomes deficient. That kind of change is masculine. Women don't tend to do this. It's all done under the guise of civilization to improve things. The impetus for this kind of change is not hatred, it is doing good work. Black people have a way of allowing things to go on the way they're going. We're not too terrified of death, not too terrified of being different, not too upset about divisions among things or people. Our interests have always been, it seems to me, on how unalike things are, rather than how alike things are. Black people always see differences before we see similarities, which means they probably cannot lump people into groups as quickly as other people can. They don't tend to say, all Polish people are such and such. They look at one person in order to see what he or she is like. So-called primitive languages always emphasize differences. You have hundreds of words for yam, but no one word for yam. Hundreds of words for every variety. That's not deficiency in the thought process. It reflects an emphasis on distinctions. It may account for why Black people, generally speaking, used to have such difficulty thinking in purely racist terms. So we're going to pause there because this interview goes on for several more pages. And I just wanted to give Taisha some time to...
I get the call from Scott. I tease Scott all the time whenever I have the opportunity to be at something that he's curated. So he knows what that's about. But when Donna invited me to this.
Bombarded you.
No, not a bombardment. When I was invited, it was a very warm and welcome invitation. And I told her, I was like, well, I was already going to be there. So I'm happy to be able to present. Toni Morrison is one of my favorite fiction writers, which sounds really impressive, but I don't read much fiction. I don't like it too much. So the fact that her writings have gripped me in a way, right, to get me to give a type of writing style a chance, I think speaks volumes to her talent and to her connection to audience. But what I also know is Toni keeps finding me in different iterations of my life, and this time period is no different. So she has an essay called Sight of Memory. And in that essay, she writes about something called the literary archaeology. And so a really good example of that would be A Beloved, right, where she takes an actual historical incident and fills in the pieces, right, so that we can get a version of a complete story. And so at the end of that essay, she has a question and answer section, and Donna and I are going to read that. So we're switching. Okay.
I would like to ask about your point of view as a novelist. Is it a vision, or are you taking the part of particular characters?
I try sometimes to have genuinely minor characters just walk through, like a walk-on actor, but I get easily distracted by them because a novelist's imagination goes like that. Every little road looks to me like an adventure, and once you begin to claim it and describe it, it looks like more, and you invent more and more and more. I don't mind doing that in my first draft, but afterward, I have to cut back. I have seen myself get distracted, and people have loomed much larger than I had planned, and minor characters have seemed a little bit more interesting than they need to be for the purposes of the book. In that case, I try to endow them. If there are little pieces of information that I want to reveal, I let them do some of the work, but I try not to get carried away. I try to restrain it so that finally the texture is consistent and nothing is wasted. There are no words in the final text that are unnecessary, and no people who are not absolutely necessary. As for the point of view, there should be the illusion that it's the character's point of view, when in fact, it isn't. It's really the narrator who is there, but who doesn't make herself, in my case, known in that role. I like the feeling of a told story, where you hear a voice, but you can't identify it, and you think it's your own voice. It's a comfortable voice, and it's a guiding voice, and it's alarmed by the same things that the reader is alarmed by, and it doesn't know what's going to happen next either. So you have this sort of guide, but that guide can't have a personality. It can only have a sound, and you have to feel comfortable with this voice, and then this voice can easily abandon itself and reveal the interior dialogue of a character. So it's a combination of using the point of view of various characters, but still retaining the power to slide in and out, provided that when I'm out, the reader doesn't see little fingers pointing to what's in the text. What I really want is that intimacy in which the reader is under the impression that he isn't really reading this, that he is participating in it as he goes along. It's unfolding, and he's always 2 beats ahead of the characters and right on target.
You have said that writing is a solitary activity. Do you go into steady seclusion when you're writing so that your feelings are sort of contained? Or do you have to get away or go out shopping and...
I do all of it. I've been at this book for 3 years. I go out shopping and I stare and I do whatever. It goes away. Sometimes it's very intense and I walk. I write a sentence and I jump up and run outside or something. It sort of beats you up. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I write long hours every day. I get up at 5:30. I get up at 5:30. I get up at 5:30 and just go do it. And if I don't like it the next day, I throw it away. But I sit down and do it. By now, I know how to get to that place where something is working. I didn't always know. I thought every thought I had was interesting because it was mine. Now, I know better how to throw away things that are not useful. I can stand around and do other things and think about it at the same time. I don't mind not writing every minute. I'm not so terrified. When you first start writing, and I think it's true for a lot of beginning writers, you're scared to death that if you don't get that sentence right if you don't get that sentence right that minute, it's never going to show up again. And it isn't. But it doesn't matter. Another one will, and it'll probably be better. And I don't mind writing badly for a couple of days because I know I can fix it, and fix it again and again and again, and it will be better. I don't have the hysteria that used to accompany some of those dazzling pages that I thought the world was just dying for me to remember. I'm a little more sanguine about it now, because the best part of it all, the absolutely most delicious part, is finishing it and then doing it over. That's the thrill of a lifetime for me. If I can just get done with that first phase and then have infinite times to fix it and change it. I rewrite a lot over and over again so that it looks like I never did it. I try to make it look like I never touched it, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of sweat.
In Song of Solomon, what was the relationship between your memories and what you made up? Was it very tenuous?
Yes, it was tenuous. For the first time, I was writing a book in which the central stage was occupied by men, and which had something to do with my loss, or my perception of loss, of a man, my father, and the world that disappeared with him. It didn't, but I felt that it did. So I was recreating a time period that was his, not biographically his life or anything in it. I use whatever is around. But it seemed to me that there was this big void left after he died, and I filled it with a book that was about men because my two previous books had women as central characters. So in that sense, it was about my memories and the need to invent. I had to do something. I was in such a rage because my father was dead. The connections between us were threads that I either mined for a lot of strength or they were purely invention. But I created a male world and inhabited it, and it had this quest, a journey from stupidity to epiphany of a man, a complete man. It was my way of exploring all that, of trying to figure out what he may have known.
Thank you. So that's all we have to read. But I just wanted to, as a practice for those who are creative, these are the types of things I revisit when I'm stuck, like writer's block or need inspiration, all of these things that we go through as creative people, right? Toni Morrison has left us so much advice on how to get through those creative times. And so, yes, her books are amazing, and yes, visit those. But her interviews, YouTube, these types, there's several books with these types of interviews, and I highly recommend those as well. So, you have any closing thoughts or anything?
No, just thank you and thank all of you.
Yes, and thank you all.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Tiasha. The wonderful hearing the interviews that Toni gave too, along with her remarkable works. So we'll take another really quick break. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So if you want to take 10, check out books, use the restroom, or grab what's left of the refreshments back there. We'll be back with our final reader, Scott Woods. And I meant to mention this up top, but if you are around tomorrow, Monday at 7 o'clock, we will be doing a book discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved. That's part of, we're wrapping up our Stories of Exile series, and we will have Simone Drake and Naomi Brenner from OSU facilitating that conversation. So again, that'll be tomorrow at 7 o'clock here at the library in the quiet reading room upstairs. And we'll be back in 10. Hello, everybody. All right. Finally got on. So we're about to wrap it up with our last speaker of the day, but I did just want to hit it again. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock, we're having a book discussion of Toni Morrison's Beloved, and if you are planning on coming out and don't know if you can find your copy of Beloved at home, we do have about 10 or so book club copies, so just find me after and I'll grab one for you. So our last reader of the day helped coordinate all the readers. So big thanks to Scott. Scott Woods, yes. Scott Woods is a poet, journalist, writer, community organizer, librarian, and overall creative powerhouse. He is the author of We Over Here Now, available for checkout in the back. Urban Contemporary History Month, and Prince and Little Weird Black Boy Gods. Scott has published and edited work in a variety of publications, including Columbus Alive, Matter News, Columbus Dispatch, and has been featured multiple times in the national press, including appearances on NPR. Scott is the co-founder and MC of the Late Writers Block Poetry Night, along with our first reader, Vernell, as well as the founder and executive director of the Streetlight Guild, which is right down Main Street. So if you haven't checked it out, please, Scott's doing amazing work over there. It's a performing arts organization that cultivates and preserves Columbus-based culture, emphasizing underrepresented voices. I'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. So, a couple things before I get started. I just want to give an incredible shout out to the sisters who preceded me this afternoon. Yes. It has really been church up in Bexley Library today. And I mean that quite literally. This function has served the purpose that such services serve. There's a lot of serve in that sentence. And so I don't take that lightly. I had hoped something like that might happen, but it's not the kind of thing you can coordinate, right? It's either there or it ain't. And I went to sisters who I thought, I was like, I think I remember such and such saying that they was really into Morrison. I think I remember such and such. And sure enough, each one of them, when I went to them, was like, bruh, bruh. And that's as evidence today, right? So thank y'all so very much. I had no concerns coming into today, except for what I was going to do, right? Also, I want to, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna interrupt myself a lot in the time we have left. I apologize, not so much. It's Black History Month, which is always a challenging time, right? Depending on where you at. And so I'm going to tell a story that I didn't tell somebody I was going to tell, but it's short. When this event started to get advertised out, some dude reached out to one of my readers and was like, yo, you might want to rethink that Bexley thing. That's the gist of what he was saying. You might want to rethink that Bexley thing. They like to, not the library specifically, just the whole community. Bexley like to tokenize Black folks sometimes. It's Black History Month too. I don't know if you want to do that. Now that didn't come directly to me. That came to one of them. And because I'm not in the news, that it didn't come to me. But, the reader and I discussed this a little bit. There wasn't much to discuss. But to me, this is the kind of thing that you want here, right? In this way, the way that we bring it, the way that we do it, the way that we organize it, the way that we embody it, right? Every space needs this. Bexley more than most. If you're going to do a Black thing in Bexley in Black History Month, it should have this weight, right? I am really awed at the amount of time that we've been afforded to do this dive into Toni Morrison, which is only the surface, right? We could do this whole 3 hours again and completely different. We could do it again and it would be completely different. So, dude had it wrong. This event has been amazing. And hopefully I can take us out on the appropriate note. I will be talking about and reading and talking about this book in particular, The Source of Self-Regard. Basically what I'm trying to draw out for you is her essay work, right? I didn't feel like I couldn't discuss her fiction or I couldn't discuss her interviews and whatnot. I love those things. But her essays is, for me, where all of her lessons sink in for me. And hopefully by the end of this event, that will be true for you. My goal is to get that book on that table checked out. So the way that we're going to do this is to note that it is important that we find ways to make the art that we encounter relevant in very concrete ways. I mean, if that's your thing, right? If you just like to read for entertainment, you can do that with Toni Morrison. I mean, it's a reach, but you can do that. It's not beach reading, right? But to me, and the way that Toni Morrison hits me, has always hit me, has been, I read her essays and then I feel like I gotta go to work. Like almost everything I do as a writer, as an event producer, as an owner of an art space, as a critic, comes from the School of Morrison, right? And one of the things about Toni Morrison that has been kind of mentioned, but I'm going to bring it up again, that is readily apparent, is her lack of concern for white gaze. She really does not care what white people think, right? And based on the number of white people here today, which I find interesting, because whenever I go on the internet and I say, Toni Morrison, white people show up in droves. Oh, I love Toni Morrison. Oh, I read her in college. Oh, I love Toni Morrison. And that's fine. I don't care. I take note. I keep score. But I don't care. And it's because I don't mention Toni Morrison to placate people. I mention Toni Morrison at all times to put people to work like she puts me to work, right? So living in Columbus right now is an interesting time if you are an artist, and I use that term broadly, okay? Writer, dancer, whatever, filmmaker, whatever. Columbus is in a place where it is, once again, contending with identity, right? What is Columbus' identity? And then a slice of that is, what does culture have to contribute to identity? I mean, technically, you don't have identity without culture, so that's kind of how that works, right? But people here frequently conflate art and culture, so what they really mean is, what does art have to do with identity? Toni Morrison talks about this at length. So I'm going to pick out an essay, and I'm going to read parts of it. I won't read it note for note. Because what I want us to walk out of here with is an idea. No, not an idea, an agenda. I'm going to give you homework. So, and as a matter of fact, I created something for this event. It's not a poem. I actually created a list of how to realize a Morrisonian artist life. And hopefully the things that I will read from today will support the lists that I will provide, all right? Now, I was going back and forth, and I was like, do I get the list first, or do I like read the stuff and then show you the list at the end? And I'm not going to keep track of time per se, so I'm just going to give you the list up front because that's the takeaway, right? And there's only 6 things on it. There were 7. I took one off. But how to realize, how to live, how to embody a Morrisonian, and I made that word up, artist life. Now, I want to be clear. I know there are artists in the room, but there are a lot of people who do not perceive themselves as artists. And that's fine. I'm not trying to make you an artist. We have enough competition, all right? But you are an audience for art. You are as important as the art we create, right? I need you to know that. And so a lot of the work that I do when I'm writing about things, when I'm criticizing things, when I'm putting on events, it's not just to show off artists. It is to develop an appetite, an appreciation, a knowledge and awareness in the audience, because we have to work together. We have to work together, right? And I don't mean in art. I mean, that's also true. But I also mean when we walk out the door, my art will do what it does, but I need you, having experienced the art, to find a concrete way to translate that into your life and take it into the pocket that you live in, the bubble, the sector, the neighborhood, the block, the business. I need you to take that with you. All of us need you to take that with you. So here's the list. Number 1, we must read. This is regardless of discipline, right? So if you're a visual artist, you must read. If you're a musician, you must read. I say this as someone who created a book club last year at Streetlight Guild. And I picked all these books, of which this was one. And I was like, yeah, if the musicians show up and the artists show up and the blase blah show up, they will have their lives changed and they will have their art changed and our people will change. And none of them showed up. Tiffany Lawson's the only one that showed up. But she already had a key to the joint, so whatever. So, and I was like, well, yep. So I have to reiterate it, that you must read. The second thing you must do is you must create. Now, this is an artist's life list, but this is true for audience as well. Now, what do you create as someone who is not an artist? I don't know. That's not for me to decide. We could talk about that. I'm sure there's something that you can deliver, right? Create, build is probably a better word for that. Build. Because then create sounds like you have to be an artist. Build, I'm going to change it. It's build. Now it's build. Build means you will go out and you will make a thing, a club, a group, right? Number 3 is criticize that which we create. This is a tough one for artists. But it shouldn't be, because that is all we do all day on the internet. All we do is criticize what people create. We criticize the criticism. We're ridiculous, right? But that's not the kind of criticism I mean. Okay, that's just killing time. We need to criticize that which we create. It has to be a productive criticism. Now, we think that means it has to be a positive criticism. That's not what I mean. All I do is talk about this city. I run the city into the ground. It's never positive, but it is productive. Right? It's productive. Number 4, find your creative community. Now, this one was tough for me. It was easy and tough. It was both. I contain multitudes. It was easy in the respect that you go to an open mic, boom, community, right? If you stick around, you don't be a jerk, community. Community will happen for you. Artists, we like to posse up, we like to squad, we like to do all these things where we, which is mostly out of fear and self-preservation, but it's still important. But it's necessary, right? You need that creative community. But it was hard for me in the sense that artists love, and again, broadly speaking, artists say they want criticism, but they're very dishonest about that. And so you need to kind of surround yourself with people who will, again, be productive about that kind of thing, right? They want you to win. You have to have people around you that want you to win. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is next to the last one. Seek financial support. This one is tricky because it sounds like some capitalism stuff, right? Get paid, chase the bag, so on and so forth. And for me, that's very not how I operate in general, right? But what we're talking about here is not to tether oneself to a system, not to do it just to live, but do it so you can create freely. Like that should be the goal, right? Like get enough to where you can create freely. That's very hard to do here because Columbus only cares about art so much. And you can tell by how many resources it gives to the arts in general, right? The museum has a very small budget for a museum, right? What you gonna do with $13 million in an art museum, right? The grants that artists receive in the city are generally very small. A lot of those opportunities didn't even exist 7, 8 years ago, right? So we're only now starting to see that kind of happen in a different way. And then the second part of this one is diversify your bonds, right? Wu-Tang says diversify your bonds, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, it's not just the grant, right? I'm running an entire venue and organization off donations. I haven't applied for a grant in years. And y'all very specifically keep that running, which lets me say, get up here and run my mouth, right? And the last point before I get into the work is that art must become food. It must be it already is something necessary, but it's easy to say that. It's hard to live it. And that one's really for the audience, because for the artist, it's literally food, right? If you don't buy my art, I don't eat, right? But I guarantee you that as audience, like this is the thing, this is your jam right here. It needs to become necessary. It's already around you. It is ubiquitous, right? It is. Our lives are completely art-laden, right? It's inescapable. We just don't see it as art. When we begin to see art in our daily lives, every hour of our daily lives, then we will do something different with it. We will expect more from it. We will put resources behind parts of it that make sense. Toni Morrison has one line about this. A writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind. They are its necessity. Right? So let's get into an essay, yes? Let's do that. If we have time, I'll touch on 2, but I'll start with the one that I think really helps make the case. Well, actually, I am going to do what I was going to do. The first essay I'm going to pick at is Literature and Public Life. This was actually a speech that she gave at Cornell University in 1998. This is the essay that I give to people when I want to show them how brilliant Toni Morrison is when she's not dropping 11 novels on you. And when she's not reading Charlie Rose for filth in an interview. This speech right here, and now again, just parts, right? The problem I want to address this evening, as I see it, the loss of public life, which is exacerbated by the degradation of private life. And I am proposing literature as an amelioration to this crisis in ways even literature could not have imagined. All right, so what is she saying here? The whole thesis of this speech is about how we have lost public life because we gave away private life. I need you to remember that this is 1998. There is no Facebook, there is no Twitter X, there is no YouTube, there is no none of that. None of that. There might have been MySpace, maybe. But we hadn't, not yet, right? We haven't hit Y2K yet. Okay? She's already on one. And she goes, not only does she tell you what your problem is, she says the solution is literature. Let us proceed. So she goes on to say, during the 80s and 90s, technology and the regime of the electronically visual world have altered perception of the public and our experience of one another. Yes. Now, remember what was passing for entertainment then. It's 98, right? So talk shows, bad news, whatever. The current age of the spectacle promised intimacy and universalization in a global village setting, but it has delivered frightful confusion about private and public existence. Following the demise of the much maligned 60s and 70s, during which there was an actual contested, fought for and fought against public and publicly expressed life, it seems unlikely that there will ever be a decade like that, where issues of conscience, morality, law, and ethics were liberationist rather than oppressive. The consequence may be apathy, disgust, resignation, or a kind of inner vacuum, numbness, a dream world of artificial stimuli and televised experience. The word prescient comes to mind, yes? Right. The woman is psychic. We live in the age of spectacle. Spectacle promises to engage us, to mediate between us and objective reality in non-judgmental ways. Well, we blew that one, right? We created those things and then we did none but the judgmental ways, right? Very like the promise of nuclear energy to be safe, clean, and cheap, but turned out to be dangerous, dirty, and expensive. The promise made by the spectacle has been forfeited. Not only are we not engaged, we are profoundly distanced, unable to discriminate, edit, or measure shock or empathy, which is why we're so performative with our ethics, right? The regime of visual authority is a coercive organization of images according to a stopwatch and passes its organization off to us as a simulacrum of the real. The news promises to inform us. I'm just going to skip that whole paragraph because you already know where that's going. You already know. Get the book. All right. Recent events, however, suggest something has gone wrong, right? The formula, the authority, the paradigm, the goals of the spectacle may not be working. The erstwhile Church of Modern Authority, television, once routinely presented news as sacred spectacle. The funeral of John F. Kennedy, the wedding of Prince Charles, presidential inaugurations, the death of Diana, all implying that what was on view was of grave national and international significance. But in the merging of news, which is not news unless pictorial, with spectacle at the service of profit-making entertainment, certain electronic narratives originally constructed as official or national stories revealed not the promised national identity, but the fault lines within. War becomes a timed and shaped story, where the electronic question becomes the political one. When will we get out? When will the troops come home? When will the despot be dead? In other national narratives, the Clarence Thomas hearing, the O.J. trial, the Whitewater investigation, the impeachment hearings, time and narrative, shape as well as plot are all subject to televised programming needs. So that's depressing. She saw it coming. She went to Cornell University one night back in '98 and said, hey, the train is coming. The light at the end of the tunnel is not the exit. She then has a piece in this essay. Well, I'll mention the literature piece. Literature has features that make it possible to experience the public without coercion and without submission. Literature refuses and disrupts passive or controlled consumption of the spectacle, designed to nationalize identity, right? Literature allows us, demands of us, the experience of ourselves as multidimensional persons. And in so doing is far more necessary than it has ever been. So what is she saying here? We must read. We must fill our lives with literature, very specifically literature. When we take a book, right, this is its own world. You may like the world, you may not like the world, but it is a world. There's a world in it. There's a setting, there's a time, right? There's place, there's body, there's people in it, even when there's no people in it, right? Every time you step to one of these things, you are stepping into focus, lack of distraction. All the distraction in a book comes from you. You're the one that distracts the book. The book is very clear. Whatever the book is, it's very clear. And we so rarely have opportunity in this day and age, in our lives, to not be distracted. She says the book is the answer. She then goes on in this essay. We don't have enough time, but I'm just going to tell you. She pulls out Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise as examples where she tells you something that she did in these books that is tricky. She gives you homework at the end of the books. She describes it as this. Each of these books, Beloved, Jazz, Paradise, has a structural anomaly in common, a post-narrative, extra text, outside the book coda that comments not on the plot or story, but on experience of the plot. Not on the meaning of the story, but on the experience of gathering meaning from the story. Everybody who came on the stage today describes this experience, even if they weren't talking about these 3 books, right? A book lets you do that. a Toni Morrison book better than most. Anyhow, I only have a few minutes left, so I want to jump to the other essay because it has very art-specific things I want to say. This is an essay entitled, this is a paper, entitled The Individual Artist. This was in 1981. She delivered this to the National Council of the Arts, who is the group that basically, what's the word? They inform the NEA, right? The National Endowment of the Arts, which she was very married to. Like, she believed in that funding because that funding was nice, right? That's life-changing money. NEA money is good money. And she doesn't care so much about money, she cares about freedom, right? So this essay in part is a pitch to artists to say, get the money, but don't get the money for cars. Don't get the money for things, right? Get the money for freedom. If I give you this check, can you go part-time on your job? Does that buy you enough time? Can you quit that job? Can you create? Imagine what you can create if you ain't got to worry about this. That's the case she's making, right? And now, for those of you who don't create, the builders, let's say, right? That's still relevant to you because this money doesn't come from nowhere. This is your money at work. But also, diversify your bonds. Because NEA ain't just throwing this money out. We need money here in Columbus. You know how hard it is to get an NEA grant? It's very difficult. So we need to find other ways as a community, right? Community is the word of the day with Toni Morrison. As a community, we need to find ways to give and to push and to support. Anyhow, here we go, individual artist. The term individual artist provokes all sorts of romantic images, pictures, and notions of a beleaguered, solitary individual struggling against Philistines, willy-nilly, who somehow breaks through the walls of ignorance and prejudice to acclaim acceptance, perhaps by a critical few in his or her lifetime, and/or posthumous fame, if not eminence, at a time when it does the artist no good. And that picture is one we love to fondle, but it is a kind of Procrustean bed, an intellectual trap, because it's such an attractive portrait that it encourages what ought to be eliminated. We seem somehow to cut off the limbs of the individual artist to fit our short bed. And we ascribe to him or her penury and sacrifice and the notion of posthumous reward. We love so much the idea of the struggling artist that we enfranchise not the artist, but the struggle. I have 50 stories about how this has played out in my artistic life in this city. Almost every artist I know that just hasn't just thrown their lot into the machine has 100 stories. Mine's only 50 because I'm successful. There's plenty of people got 10 times that bad story, right? Anyhow, she goes on. I sometimes wonder if we really and truly mean it. Do we really mean that the world is the poor because too few appreciate the finer things? Suppose we did live in a world in which people chatted about Descartes and Kant, Liechtenstein, and McDonald's. Suppose Twelfth Night was on the bestseller list. Would we be happy? Or would we decide that since everybody appreciated it, maybe it wasn't any good? Or maybe if the artist himself had not begged for his life, begged and struggled through poverty, perhaps on into death, perhaps his art wasn't any good. There seems to have been an enormous amount of comfort taken in some quarters, in print and in conversation, that when thousands and thousands of people stood in line to see the Picasso show, only 4 or 5% of the people who saw it really knew what they were seeing. There's a lot going on in that paragraph, but I think I'm out of time. You sure? I won't abuse that. Oh, I will abuse that. You remember on my list where I was talking about criticism? Here's a dope paragraph from this essay, again, the individual artist, where she talks about criticism. Now, remember, it's important to note that Toni Morrison, for all her street cred, she was an academic, right? She was an editor at Random House, right? So she was in it, in the thick of it. The system is the it, right? But anyhow, in the contemporary world of art and scholarship, right, literature is, I think, the only discipline in which the scholars do not produce what they criticize. If you think about all the people who write book reviews, they don't write books, right? The critics of music, aside from all them random cats on the internet. Like music critics don't put out records. Art critics, like actual get paid magazine art critics, of which there are only a handful left, right? Because the internet killed that job, right? They're not artists. They're not artists. They don't create. And we don't want them to, probably. Not those particular people, right? But she pulls that out. The chemists, the social scientists, the historians, the philosopher, all of those people produce what they teach. They produce what they question. They produce what they change. In literary criticism, the critic now produces the criticism that he teaches. He produces the discipline and the subject of the discipline, which is the text. The text is peripheral to the discussion. Mind you, this is a woman whose work is studied every day. Like every day. We will never not have Toni Morrison, right? Which lends to this feeling that she's not gone, right? So much. I'm just going to blast through the rest of it. So she says some more stuff about social media. She talks about support, specifically endowments, where she says that plays an incomparable role in an artist's life. And she even kind of touches on her own very early success, where she says, well, first of all, I'm going to tell you something she said earlier. First novels shouldn't be successes. They're supposed to be read by a few. They are not supposed to be profitable. They must be limited. If a first novel makes it, then there is some suspicion about its quality. Now, you will recall, The Bluest Eye was a big hit. But she is still, in a way, talking about what happened to her, in a way, right? Because what happened when Toni Morrison came out? She put out this book, this undeniable book, this invincible book, this book that we literally read out of today, 50 years later, several years later. And yet, she was dogged her entire career, her entire professional life with the same stupid questions. Why don't you write about white people? Do you ever write about white people? Yada, yada, yada. And that's because she's black. It's not even because she's just a woman. It's because she's black. All right? And I was just trying to decide if I had just stepped on a landmine just then from the interview section about how men engage. Anyhow, whatever. It's cool, it's cool. Like even her, coming out the gate, Toni Morrison, still contending with these issues. Her entire career. It didn't matter. Nobel Prize didn't matter. Same question, right? Anyhow, let me wrap this up. She closes this essay out more or less about support, endowment, stuff like that. Remember, her audience is the NEA, right? The National Council of the Arts, right? She's basically telling them, you need to do more, we need to do more, you must give life-changing amounts of support to art because that is the only way we get life change. So and again, I'm gonna wrap this up. And this is important because Columbus is in the thick of discussions about identity, as I said, and public art, right? Things like that. I remember a time years ago when I sat on a literature panel. The big problem was trying to get the writers to apply. They didn't want it. They thought they were going to be censored. They thought the government was meddling in their books. They thought they couldn't say certain things. There was a taint attached to the acceptance of the fellowship grants and the direct grants. And only with persistence were the panels able to overcome it. With persistence, the panels of the endowment have become Brother Theo to little Vinnie Van Gogh. They have become a friend, which if you don't get the reference, Van Gogh was broke his entire life. His brother, right, anyhow. So they have become a friend to little Jimmy Joyce. They are a platform for that outrageous, shocking, controversial George Bernard Shaw. But in addition, we are food. We are rent. We are medical care for the arrogant and feisty Zora Neale Hurston, who didn't have any of that at the end. We have a chance to be the audience in the performance hall, right, builders? For Scott Joplin, who didn't have it at the end. What we do is no small thing. It is the first of the 5 legs on which the endowment stands. So anyhow, Toni Morrison, I'm gonna wrap this up by saying, you're doing the work right now. Especially those of you who sat through 3 hours, right? Like you built something here a little bit, just a touch. You started to. And I thank you so much for being here. I didn't think anybody was gonna show up to this. I'm not no shade. But I wasn't sure. You never know. Whatever. You don't want to assume. But I am so heartened by your presence and your attention and the brilliance and energy and intelligence that my sisters brought to the table to make this moment possible. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bexley Library. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody.
And really quick again, thank you so much to our readers, Vernell Bristow, Stevi Knighton, Donna Marbury, Tiasha, and Scott Woods. And thank you all for coming out and celebrating Toni Morrison on her birthday. So have a great night.